What does it take to build the largest land empire in human history? Not just to conquer, but to connect continents, to ride from the forests of Siberia to the shores of the Mediterranean, and leave behind a trail that still shapes our world today. I asked that question as I stood beneath the endless sky of the Mongolian steppe. The wind carried no answer, only silence and the faint whisper of hoofbeats long faded. But the clues are still there, buried in forgotten ruins, hidden in ancient scrolls, echoing through the roads we still travel. How did a boy named Temujin, born into exile and hunger, rise to become Genghis Khan? What did he see that others did not? And why did so many follow him across oceans of grass and into the cities of empires? What made the Mongol army so feared and yet so precise? How did they go from nomads to governors of millions, from tent dwellers to rulers of palaces? And what caused it all to fall apart? Was it rebellion, plague, or the burden of becoming what they once despised? This is a story of speed and silence, of war and wisdom, of power gained and power lost. Join me now as we trace the forgotten path of the Mongol Empire. The journey begins with a single hoof print in the dust. The wind was a whisper that never stopped. It pulled at the edge of my tent, crept through the seams of my boots, and howled across the wide plains of eastern Mongolia. The sky stretched so far it seemed to swallow the world. Beneath it, the land was flat and endless, broken only by the shadow of distant ridges and the flicker of campfires that dotted the horizon like fallen stars. Here, in this unforgiving silence, a boy once wandered. His name was Temujin. He was born into uncertainty, into a world where power meant the strength of your kin, the sharpness of your arrows, and the speed of your horse. There were no cities, no palaces, only tribes that lived by the bow and died by betrayal. His father, Yasugai, had been a chief, a man of reputation and alliances. But when poison took him, the fragile threads that held his family's influence together snapped. The tribe abandoned Temujin and his mother. They were cast out into the wilderness, left to starve, left to vanish. When I walked the lands where he grew, I could still feel the rawness of survival in the air. The grass beneath my feet hid old trails, routes Temujin might have walked, barefoot and hungry. The trees whispered the names of brothers who turned on each other, of half-siblings bound by blood but fractured by ambition. I imagined the boy staring into the coals of a dying fire, not with fear but with resolve. Every hardship would become a lesson, every betrayal a memory carved into bone. Over time, he began to gather allies, slowly, carefully, not through gold or rank, but through loyalty and vision. He freed slaves, he elevated commoners, he repaid trust with trust. In a world where kinship ruled, Temujin broke tradition, and in doing so, he planted the seeds of something new, something vast. By the time he reached his early 20s, small bands rode beneath his command. They were not yet an army, but they were more than scattered clans. They fought together, bled together. His name began to travel with the wind, whispered in tents, muttered in rival camps. Not everyone welcomed his rise. Old tribal leaders saw him as a threat to the ancient order. They tried to break him. They failed. I stood one morning where the Onon River curves like a silver blade across the plain. The sun rose behind me. Mist clung to the grass. This was where Temujin first met with his closest allies to form what would become the Steppe Alliance. Bows were laid down, vows were spoken. Under the open sky, bound not by blood but by purpose, the tribes began to merge. The bond they formed was not fragile. It was forged in fire and famine, loyalty and loss. At the great council known as a Kuriltai, chieftains raised him high and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The title was more than a crown, it was a declaration. The steppes were no longer fractured. A storm was gathering. When I left that place, I took a handful of earth and let it fall between my fingers. That soil had once borne the hoofbeats of the men who followed him, riders who believed in something greater than their own clan. I could almost hear them still, not shouting but galloping, their shadows long against the rising sun. Before the cities burned, before the empires trembled, there was this moment. One man, one vision, one alliance. And history shifted. The morning light broke over the plains like a promise. I rode toward the site of the great Kuriltai, the tribal gathering where it all began. The air was still heavy with memory. Even now, centuries later, I could feel the weight of that moment pressing into the soil. There were no ruins to mark the place, no statues, just wind, grass, and the endless blue of the Mongolian sky. And yet, something lingered, something sacred. It was the year 1206. At the age of around 40, Temujin stood among his peers, not as a warlord, not as a prince, but as a man chosen by merit, raised by hardship, tested by betrayal. Before him gathered the chiefs of dozens of tribes. Some had once been enemies, others childhood allies. All had known war, all had known hunger, and now they had come to witness the birth of something greater than themselves. The Kuriltai was no mere meeting, it was a ritual, a reckoning, a vow. Horses circled the camp, banners fluttered in the wind. Elders spoke in long, deliberate tones, recounting battles, lineages, pacts sealed and broken. The sound of drums echoed across the steppe, deep and steady, like the pulse of the earth itself. Then, silence fell, and in that stillness, Temujin was given a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It was not just a title, it was a transformation. No longer merely a leader of men, he became a symbol of unity, of purpose. In a world torn by tribal rivalries and endless revenge, he offered something radical, a shared identity forged not by bloodlines, but by belief. "Follow me," he seemed to say, "and together we will become something that has never existed before." I could picture it as I stood there, the sea of felt tents, the smell of smoke and horsehair, the songs carried on the breeze. I could almost see the faces of those who swore loyalty that day, hardened riders with scarred hands, young warriors with eyes full of fire, women who managed camps, rode with scouts, and kept the pulse of the army beating, all of them choosing a new future. But uniting the tribes was not only a matter of ceremony, it required careful strategy. Genghis Khan restructured the very bones of Mongol society. He broke the old clan system and replaced it with a decimal organization. Groups of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Each unit mixed across former loyalties, forcing men to fight not beside their kin, but beside those chosen for skill and loyalty. He rewarded bravery, he punished betrayal, and above all, he demanded obedience to the law he called the Yasa. It was a law without paper, spoken rather than written, but its effects were real. Stealing was met with swift justice. Disobedience brought exile or death. But it was not fear alone that bound the Mongols together. It was trust. A warrior could rise regardless of birth. A slave could become a commander. A messenger's words were sacred. Even in the heart of war, rules endured. I walked the perimeter of where the Kurultai might have stood. The grass was short, and the wind moved in soft waves. There were no voices now, only memory. Yet in my mind I heard the final words of that gathering, as riders mounted their horses, turned their faces westward, and set out to make the world theirs. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a tidal wave. With the tribes now won, the steppe had found its spear, and the world was about to feel its tip. The first time I rode across the steppe at full gallop, I understood something I had only read in books. The wind roared in my ears, the ground blurred beneath the hooves, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of motion and breath. It was not just speed, it was freedom, precision, power. And it was here, on this endless sea of grass, that the Mongol war machine was born. Before they conquered empires, they mastered the horse, not as riders alone, but as extensions of the animal itself. Every Mongol warrior had multiple mounts. While one horse rested, another carried him onward. Their herds moved with them, sustaining the army like a living supply line. Even in retreat, they moved faster than others in pursuit. It was not strategy in the way cities understood it. It was instinct sharpened into doctrine. Each man was trained from childhood. By the age of 5, they rode as if they were born in the saddle. They hunted, fought, played games that taught agility and awareness. And when war came, they were already ready. The bow they carried was a composite weapon of horn, sinew, and wood. Compact, deadly. At full gallop, they could twist in the saddle and loose an arrow behind them with uncanny accuracy. The famous Parthian shot, but perfected. I stood once in a narrow pass in the Altai Mountains, the site of a Mongol ambush recorded in old chronicles. The rocks still bore marks of fires. Scattered arrowheads lay buried in the dust. I imagined the scene: enemy forces drawn into the gap, confident, then swarmed from the cliffs, from the flanks, from behind. It was not just speed, it was silence, coordination, total control of terrain. The Mongols did not rely on brute force alone. They scouted obsessively, sending riders hundreds of miles ahead to map roads, rivers, cities. They used false retreats, lured enemies into traps, and struck with terrifying precision. Communication was key. Relay stations, known as yam, stretched across their routes. Fresh horses, fresh riders. Messages could travel faster than armies. Intelligence was not an afterthought. It was the backbone. And then came the conquests. First the Tanguts of Shisha, then the Jin dynasty. Their fortresses fell like dominoes. By the time the Khwarezmian Empire provoked them by killing their envoys, the Mongol storm had reached full strength. I followed their path through Central Asia, where towns once thriving had been reduced to silence. But even ruin told its story. Not mindless destruction, strategic dismantling. Resistance was punished, surrender often spared. Their tactics evolved. Engineers from China helped build siege towers and catapults. Persian scholars were consulted. No knowledge was discarded. No advantage ignored. The Mongols became a mirror. They reflected the strength of every culture they encountered, and then used it as a weapon. I sat by a campfire one night on the edge of the old Silk Road, the same route Mongol scouts once took to flank unsuspecting kingdoms. The stars above were clear, cold. I thought of those scouts riding by starlight, tracking every shadow, mapping every pass. A network of minds stretched across half the known world, all focused on a single purpose: expansion. It was not magic, it was motion, discipline, and adaptability. While others relied on walls, the Mongols trusted the wind and the hoof. No terrain was too distant, no fortress too high. To face them was not just to face an army, it was to face the horizon itself, coming for you at the speed of the horse. This was not the end of their advance, it was only the opening strike, and the earth, still quiet beneath my feet, remembered every hoofbeat. I came upon the ruins by accident. The map showed nothing, just a faded outline near the old Silk Road where the desert begins to harden into stone. But the broken walls spoke louder than any ink. I stepped over fallen gates, cracked tiles, chunks of what had once been towers. There was no wind that day, only silence. As if the city, even in death, refused to speak of what had happened. This was a place that had resisted the Mongols, and resistance in those days came at a cost. The Mongols were born on the plains, swift and elusive, masters of open warfare. But when the great cities of Persia and China rose in their path, they did not retreat. They adapted. And what they became was something far more terrifying. They learned to break stone, to pull down walls, to turn their speed into strategy and their patience into pressure. They studied siege warfare like hunters study the habits of prey. At first, they brought Chinese engineers into their ranks, men skilled in building towers and catapults, men who had spent lifetimes studying how to unmake a city. The Mongols absorbed that knowledge quickly. Trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, underground tunnels to collapse fortifications from below. They used them all, not as curiosities, but as instruments of methodical destruction. I stood beside a shattered tower in Nishapur, where the final assault had ended in smoke and silence. In the dust, I found fragments of glazed tile, bone, melted glass. The siege had not just broken walls, it had broken spirit. Genghis Khan's fury here was not random. A beloved general had been killed. And so, the response was total. Entire populations were wiped away. But not all sieges ended in blood. In many cases, the mere threat of Mongol assault was enough. Their reputation preceded them like a storm cloud. Cities that opened their gates were often spared. Merchants could keep their wares. Officials kept their posts. But if a gate was barred, if a message delayed, if a single rider was harmed, then retribution came swift and final. The line between mercy and destruction was thin and deliberate. They surrounded cities with discipline, cut supply lines, waited in Baghdad, in Samarkand, in Zhongdu. Some cities held for weeks, others for months, but the outcome was almost always the same. Walls cracked, defenders fell, and the Mongols entered like a tide. Not chaotic, but organized. Each soldier knew his role. Loot was distributed under command. No soldier could claim without permission. Orders were absolute. I once held a rusted Mongol arrowhead in my palm, dug from the earth outside a ruined gate. It was simple, practical, deadly, like the army it belonged to. And yet, these were not mindless destroyers. They took maps, gathered scribes, preserved texts that interested them. Any knowledge that could serve the empire was kept, copied, or brought back to the steppe. Even in conquest, there was method, and that method bred fear. The cities of the ancient world had once been centers of power, walled, arrogant, safe. But the Mongols taught the world that no wall was high enough, no gate strong enough, and no distance too great. Siegecraft had become more than war. It had become a statement. When I left the ruins, the wind picked up again. It moved through the gaps in the stone like breath through broken teeth. The city had fallen centuries ago, but its lessons still stood. In the age of horse and bow, even the mightiest cities learned to bow, not to emperors, but to the silence that rode in from the steppe. The sun was low when I reached the old caravan trail. The sky burned orange behind the hills, and the dust clung to my boots like memory. There were no more camels now, no wagons creaked by. But the stones beneath my feet still remembered the rhythm of trade. This was once the highway of empires, the thread that stitched the east to the west. And for a time, under Mongol rule, it flowed without interruption. They called it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It began not with treaties, but with terror, with cities brought low and rival powers swept aside. But once the fires dimmed and the dust settled, something remarkable took shape. The Mongols, those nomads of the steppe, understood the value of what they now controlled. Roads, routes, ports, markets. They did not destroy commerce, they redirected it, and then they protected it. I walked along a stretch of what had once been part of the Silk Road, a route that ran from China to the shores of the Mediterranean. Traders once moved here under the watch of Mongol patrols. They carried silks, spices, jewels, and glass. But they also carried knowledge, language, ideas. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the caravanserais were rebuilt, way stations stocked with food and fresh horses. The empire became a vast artery, and every beat carried something precious. Security was strict. Robbery along the trade routes became rare. The penalty for harming a merchant was swift and unforgiving. A single passport, issued by the Khan, could carry you from the Great Wall to the Volga. It was called a paisa, and holding one meant the empire recognized your journey. Few dared to challenge that symbol. At night, I sat beneath an open sky where once Marco Polo might have camped. He had traveled from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan through cities that glittered in the Mongol twilight. He was not the only one. Traders from Europe, scholars from Persia, doctors from India, all found passage under the Khans. And with them came more than goods. They brought news, techniques. The very fabric of global culture began to weave itself along those roads, but not all that traveled was welcome. Diseases moved too, most infamously the Black Death. Carried by traders, stowaway rats, and unseen bacteria, it followed the same safe passages that had once been lifelines. In time, those routes would spread plague across continents. Yet even this cannot erase what the Mongols achieved. For a brief and shining moment, the world was open in a way it had never been before. The empire taxed trade, but it also facilitated it. Paper currency appeared in markets where only silver had once been trusted. Multilingual scribes kept records in Chinese, Arabic, Persian, and Mongolian. In some cities, Buddhist monks lived beside Muslim merchants and Christian emissaries. I found traces of all of them in the worn stone of caravanserai walls. Names carved in different scripts, prayers offered to different skies. The Mongol Empire was not built to last, but the peace it created along the Silk Road reshaped what commerce could mean. It was not just about profit, it was about connection, movement, exchange. As I left the trail behind, I turned once more to look out across the vastness. The road had faded, but the idea remained that in the aftermath of conquest, something unexpected had bloomed. The world, for a time, had spoken in many tongues but moved in one direction, and it moved beneath the watchful eye of the Khans. The cold came first. A sharp, dry wind rolling down from the steppes, brushing the forests of the north with whispers of something vast approaching. I stood at the edge of the Russian plain, where birch trees swayed like white ghosts and the ground crackled under frost. It was here, centuries ago, that the Mongols turned their gaze northwest, and Europe felt the thunder of hooves. This was the rise of the Golden Horde. After the great campaigns across Central Asia and Persia, Genghis Khan's successors looked to the lands of the Rus, cities built of timber and pride. Princes locked in endless rivalry. The Mongols saw opportunity. In the early 1330s, Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, led the armies west. With him came seasoned generals, hardened riders, and memories of victories stretching across thousands of miles. The invasion began with fire. I visited the ruins near Ryazan, a once proud principality, now reduced to earth and whispers. The chronicles tell of its fall in winter, the snow stained with ash, the bells of churches silenced. I found fragments of charred wood frozen deep in soil that had never forgotten. This was not random destruction. It was calculated. Each city taken was a message to the next. The Mongols crossed frozen rivers as if they were roads. They moved through forests, across plains, bypassing natural barriers with the same fluidity they showed in deserts and mountains. The cities of Vladimir, Suzdal, and Moscow fell in sequence. Some resisted and were burned. Others submitted and were spared, but taxed. This pattern was not new. It was the Mongol way. Conquest, followed by structure. Destruction, then order. Batu Khan established his capital at Sarai, near the Volga River. I walked the banks of that river, where traders once gathered under the eye of the Golden Horde. Sarai was no mere outpost. It became a vibrant city, a seat of administration, a center of commerce. From here, the Mongols governed much of what is now southern Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. The Golden Horde was named not for color, but for reverence. In Mongol culture, gold signified the center, the ruling force. This Khanate became a power unto itself. It collected tribute from Russian princes, dictated terms, and allowed some measure of autonomy so long as the flow of silver did not stop. Europe watched with fear. To the west, kingdoms like Hungary and Poland scrambled to prepare. I followed the path of Mongol scouts across the Carpathians, where monasteries once rang alarm bells at the sight of unfamiliar banners. In the spring of 1241, Mongol armies crushed European forces at the Battle of Liegnitz and then again at Mohi, victory after victory. And then they withdrew. Why they turned back remains a mystery. Some say it was the death of the great Khan in Mongolia that recalled the generals. Others believe the campaign had always been meant to test, not conquer. Whatever the reason, the tide receded, but the imprint remained. The Golden Horde ruled for over 2 centuries. Its presence shaped Russian history, delaying unification but laying the groundwork for Moscow's eventual rise. I saw churches built during that era, their designs quietly influenced by Eastern motifs. I heard songs in Tatar and Russian that shared rhythms, words, echoes. The Mongols never fully ruled Europe, but their shadow stretched far across it. As I watched the last light vanish behind the trees of the steppe, I felt that shadow still. The Golden Horde had been more than a branch of empire. It was a bridge between worlds, between the nomadic and the settled, between the east and the west, and across that bridge rode horsemen whose names the forest never forgot. I stood on the edge of a former capital, where stone met sand and silence settled like dust. There were no riders now, no banners snapping in the wind. But beneath the scattered ruins, I could feel the weight of decisions once made. Ruling by conquest is one thing. Governing what you conquer is another. And for the Mongols, the empire they had carved in blood now needed to be held by something else entirely. It began with a question of scale. From the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, the Mongol Empire spanned more land than any other contiguous empire in history. It was not enough to be feared, they had to be understood. And to govern millions of people from countless cultures and traditions, they had to adapt. Genghis Khan understood this early. I walked through what remains of Karakorum, the first imperial capital, and found stones etched in many tongues: Uyghur script, Persian, Chinese. The empire spoke with many voices. So the Mongols did something few conquerors dared. They listened. They recruited administrators from the very lands they conquered. Persians ran the tax offices, Chinese engineers maintained the canals, Arabs translated legal codes. The Mongols ruled, but they did not insist that only their ways held value. They absorbed what worked, and they used it to tighten their grip. At the heart of their governance was the Yasa. It was not a law written on scrolls and locked in palaces. It was oral, living, enforced through loyalty and fear. It covered everything from military discipline to personal conduct. Disobedience could cost your life. But fairness earned protection. Even a peasant under Mongol rule had rights if he followed the code. I saw the remnants of an old way station along the Yam system, the vast relay network that kept the empire connected. Every 20 to 30 miles, a new post, fresh horses, hot food, shelter for messengers. It made communication across thousands of miles not only possible, but fast. I imagined the riders, cloaked against the wind, galloping under moonlight, carrying orders sealed by the great Khan himself. Taxes were collected with brutal efficiency. The Mongols had no patience for disorganization. Census records were maintained, trade routes monitored, tribute counted. Yet, unlike some empires, they did not always interfere with local customs. If a city paid what was owed and followed the rules, it could keep its religion, its officials, even its local courts. In Baghdad, I traced the outlines of old record halls. In Samarkand, I stood beneath domes built by Mongol patronage. The administration was not just practical, it was architectural, a visible declaration of order. Wherever I went, I saw signs of compromise, of control through adaptation. It was never about erasing identity, it was about folding it into the empire. But not all was stable. In time, the balance grew fragile. As generations passed, new rulers were born far from the saddle, in cities surrounded by luxury. The further the empire reached, the more distant it became from its nomadic roots. Governors began to feud. Corruption crept into the system, and what had once been a lean machine of control started to strain beneath its own size. Still, the legacy remained. I watched the sun fall behind the hills where the old roads converged. Roads built not only for conquest, but for governance. The Mongols had not simply broken the world, they had tried to shape it, not just with arrows, but with ink, with rules, with choices, and across the vastness, that attempt still echoes. Quiet, complex, and unfinished. The grass grew taller here, untouched, quiet. I stood where the steppe began to fade into farmland, where the open sky gave way to cultivated hills and walled towns. This was the edge of two worlds, the nomadic and the settled, and for the Mongols, it was never a comfortable crossing. Conquest had come easy, but ruling these sedentary lands, holding them living among stone and harvest instead of wind and herd, That was something different, something heavier. The empire had stretched itself wide, from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary. But with each new province, with every city absorbed, the Mongols faced the same challenge: how to remain who they were, while managing what they had taken. A people born to motion, now tethered to borders. I followed an old road near Bukhara, where caravans once passed under the watch of Mongol patrols. The road was cracked, quiet, but I could still imagine the weight of supplies, the chatter of merchants, the flicker of imperial flags. These routes were the veins of an empire, but keeping them open required something the Mongols were not built for: bureaucracy. The more territory they gained, the more administrators they needed, the more resources they required. Grain, timber, iron, silver. They taxed the peasants. They conscripted artisans. They imposed order where once there had been none. And in doing so, they became something they had never intended to be: managers of empire rather than riders of the wind. In China, under the rule of Kublai Khan, the transformation was clearest. I stood in the ruins of Xanadu, his summer capital. The foundation spoke of elegance, of design rooted in both Mongol tradition and Chinese sophistication. Palaces, gardens, waterworks. It was beautiful, but also fixed, heavy with wealth. Kublai adopted Chinese court customs, wore their silks, sat beneath painted ceilings. He ruled as emperor, not Khan, and yet that choice brought its own burdens. Settled governance came with layers of responsibility. Famine in one region meant rerouted grain. Rebellion in another meant garrisons had to be maintained. Disease moved through dense cities in ways the steppe had never known. The empire that had once traveled with the wind now struggled beneath the weight of its own immobility. I walked through a village in northern Persia. Simple homes, quiet fields. Once Mongol officials had passed here, collecting tribute, enforcing law. But the record showed something else too: discontent. The people had no loyalty to their distant khans, only fear. And over time, fear eroded. Where loyalty does not grow, cracks always follow. The burden of empire grew internal. No longer were they only defending borders, now they were defending policies. Grain shipments, tax codes. Religious tolerance in one province sparked outrage in another. The unity forged by the saddle was now tested by parchment and coin. The rhythms of the nomad were drowned beneath the needs of the city. Still, they tried to hold it together. Through alliances, through shared law, through memory. But I saw it in the records, in the poetry, even in the architecture. The Mongols were becoming what they once toppled: an imperial class trapped by its own size. They no longer moved like the wind. They moved like statesmen. And that shift, subtle and slow, began to reshape everything. As I left that village, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields. I thought of those early riders, faces to the wind, unburdened by maps or ledgers. What they carried then was light. Now, their descendants carried the weight of rule, heavy, uneven, and impossible to outrun. The wind was still the day I reached the place they say he died. Somewhere near the Hexi corridor, though no stone marks it, no shrine. Just wind and earth and a silence that feels heavier than usual. Genghis Khan, the man who reshaped continents, passed into legend without leaving behind a tomb. His death was kept secret for weeks, his body hidden, his burial lost to time. But even before he died, the cracks had already begun. Succession. The word echoed across every empire in history. The Mongols were no exception. For all his strength, Genghis Khan left behind more than just conquered lands. He left behind sons, brothers, rivals, each with their own ambitions, each with their own loyalties. And the question rose like dust from the steppe: who would hold the reins next? The process had been outlined in theory: a Kurultai, a council of leaders, a vote of sorts, but in practice, succession was never smooth. I sat once in a valley where two Mongol armies had clashed, not against outsiders, but against each other. The grass still grows thin where horses once churned the soil, tribe against tribe, banner against banner. Genghis had appointed his son Ogedei as successor, but blood alone was not enough to prevent ambition. When Ogedei took the throne, the empire continued to expand, but when he died, the struggle reignited. Delays in selecting a new great Khan paused conquests. Generals returned from the field to attend councils that became contests, and beneath every discussion was the same quiet fear. Could this vast empire truly be held together by anything other than Genghis himself? His sons and grandsons divided the realm into Khanates: the Golden Horde in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Il Khanate in Persia, and later, the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan. On paper, they were branches of the same tree, but in practice, each began to grow in its own direction. I followed old correspondence once carried by Mongol couriers. The messages began formal, respectful, but over time tones shifted, disagreements grew, border disputes emerged between brothers. Even letters between cousins began to carry warnings rather than greetings. The unity that had once made them unstoppable began to splinter into ambition and suspicion. One day in the archives of Tabriz, I read an account from a Persian historian. He described the empire not as a single body, but as a fire split into scattered flames, bright, dangerous, but no longer unified. And it was true. The Khans now ruled from distant courts. They spoke different tongues, followed different faiths. Some converted to Islam, others embraced Buddhism or Christianity. The common thread of steppe tradition began to fray, and yet the myth of Genghis lingered. Even generations after his death, his name held weight. Coins still bore his title. Laws still cited his decrees. His standard, the 9 yak tails, was still revered. But as each Khanate drifted further into independence, his vision dimmed, not by failure, but by distance, by the slow, inevitable gravity of time. I stood once at a river that had marked the border between two Khanates. The water moved gently, unaware of the tension it once witnessed. The Mongol Empire had not collapsed in a single moment. It fractured, like ice cracking under unseen pressure, one piece at a time. As I left that riverbank, the wind picked up again, dry, sharp, the same wind he had known. Genghis Khan was gone. But the question he left behind, how do you hold an empire that rides faster than words, remains unanswered. The mist hung low over the ruins of Xanadu when I arrived. Grass pushed through cracked stone, the lotus ponds had dried to silence, yet even in ruin the place breathed ambition. Here, in the summer capital of Kublai Khan, the empire of the steppe reached its most refined form. It was not the roar of conquest I felt. It was the quiet weight of transformation. Kublai Khan was no ordinary successor. He was a grandson of Genghis, but born into a different world, a world of courts and scholars, of trade and empire. Unlike his ancestors, who lived and died in the saddle, Kublai had been raised among ideas. He read Chinese classics, he studied governance, he listened, and then he acted. When he set his sights on China, it was not just a campaign of conquest, it was a vision of rule. At the time, China was fractured. The southern Song dynasty held its ground behind rivers and cities, but the north had already fallen. Kublai understood that to truly govern China, he could not remain only a Mongol. He had to become something more. I stood inside the ghostly outline of Dadu, later known as Beijing. Kublai made it his capital. He filled it with stone buildings, wide avenues, administrative offices, gardens shaped with precision. It was a city of logic and spectacle. From here he ruled not only by force, but by ritual. He adopted Chinese-style bureaucracy, retained local officials, even took on the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule in Chinese philosophy. And yet, he never fully abandoned his roots. Mongol guards still patrolled the walls. Steppe horses grazed just beyond the palace. Yurts stood beside tiled roofs. The emperor wore silk robes in the court, but still dined with his generals in felt tents. It was a balance he struggled to maintain. To the Chinese, he was always foreign. To many Mongols, he was no longer one of them. I read accounts from travelers who visited Kublai's court. Marco Polo described it with awe. Gold-paneled halls, paper money, efficient postal systems. A realm where commerce flowed and cultures mingled. And it was true. Under Kublai, the Yuan dynasty brought innovation. Trade boomed. Infrastructure expanded. Roads, canals, granaries, all carefully maintained. It was one of the most stable times in China's imperial history. But peace came at a cost. The further Kublai drifted into sedentary life, the more he lost the allegiance of the steppe. The other Mongol Khanates began to ignore his authority. Letters sent west received no reply. The empire was still vast, but no longer whole. I walked once through the remains of a tax station south of the Yangtze. The record showed growing discontent, peasants overburdened, officials corrupt. The very system Kublai had built began to strain under its own weight. The military campaigns continued into Burma, Vietnam, and Japan. But many ended in failure. Ships lost to storms. Armies swallowed by jungle. The great tide had turned. Kublai Khan died in his palace in the winter of 1294. He had ruled for over 3 decades, longer than any Khan before him. But at the end, his health failed, his court fractured, and his dream of uniting steppe and city faded like the echo of drums across cold stone. As I left the grounds of Xanadu, I touched the corner of a carved pillar, its details softened by time. Kublai had tried to bridge 2 worlds. He had raised an empire with one hand and held tradition with the other. But in the end, the weight was too great. Still, the stones remember. And through them, so do we. The air in the village was thick with dust. I walked between fields gone fallow, where cracked earth split under my boots and old irrigation channels lay dry. This had once been a place of promise. Crops heavy in the sun, markets full, children chasing chickens between the stalls. But that world had slipped away, and in its place came hunger, frustration, rebellion. By the late 1300s, the foundations of Mongol power had begun to crumble. Not from outside invasions, not from grand battles, but from within. The system that had once brought peace across thousands of miles now strained under its own complexity. In China, under the Yuan dynasty, the court had grown distant. Bureaucrats bickered, tax collectors grew greedy. Corruption seeped through the channels of governance like water through cracked stone. The people felt it first. They always do. I spoke with local historians near the ruins of a UN-era granary. They told me stories passed down through generations, families who could not afford to feed their children, entire towns burdened by rising levees. And then came the floods. The Yellow River, unpredictable and wild, shifted its course again. Farmland drowned, others dried to dust. The great machine of empire, once so efficient, could no longer respond, and in that silence the people rose. In the south, secret societies began to form. The Red Turbans, named for the color of their headscarves, emerged from Buddhist sects preaching change. They promised justice, bread, a return to something better. Their message spread fast. I walked through a mountain pass where one of their first victories was recorded. No grand monument marked the spot, just a few stones stacked by travelers. A quiet signal that once here, the tide began to turn. The Yuan armies, stretched thin, failed to respond in time. Rebellions flared like wildfires, not just in China, but across the Mongol world. In Persia, the Khanates splintered after a series of weak rulers and economic collapse. In the Chagatai Khanate, internal strife turned brothers into enemies. Even the once mighty Golden Horde began to falter, shaken by dynastic struggles and uprisings among the conquered Slavic peoples. I found a letter in an old monastery archive, written by a Mongol official stationed in northern China. His words were weary. He spoke of caravans attacked, roads unsafe, couriers killed. The wind has changed, he wrote, and it does not carry our banners anymore. Nature played its role too. Famine deepened, harsh winters came, and the people, once silenced by fear, now saw weakness in the ruling class. The image of the Mongol invincibility, polished through decades of conquest, had dulled, cracked, and beneath it, fury waited. Kublai Khan had tried to hold it all together, but after his death, his successors proved less capable. The Yuan dynasty in China faced growing opposition. And in the year 1368, a former peasant monk named Zhu Yuanzhang seized the capital. He declared the birth of the Ming dynasty. The Mongol court fled north. Their rule in China was over. But this was more than just a change in dynasty. It was a turning of the age. As I stood atop an old hill fort once manned by Mongol scouts, I looked out over valleys that had once echoed with the sound of hooves. Now they echoed with a quieter truth. No empire, no matter how vast, escapes the cycle of rise and fall. Rebellion is not born in anger alone, it is born in silence, in empty bowls, in broken promises. And once it begins, it rarely stops where it started. I walked through an abandoned village once touched by plague. The wooden frames of homes still leaned against each other like dying trees. The well had long since dried. The wind moved through the open doorways as if remembering footsteps that would never return. There was no fire here, no war, only silence and death. The Black Death did not come with a roar. It arrived quietly in the shadows of trade. It followed the same roads that once carried silk and salt. It moved with merchants, with soldiers, with rats and fleas. And when it struck, it did not ask permission. It simply devoured. The Mongol Empire had built one of the most connected networks the world had ever seen. The Silk Road was secure. Caravans moved swiftly, borders were open, but those very strengths became cracks when disease came. In the early 1340s, reports of illness began to surface in Central Asia. By the time they reached the Black Sea, entire cities had already been lost. I stood at the port of Kaffa, where Mongol forces once laid siege to a Genoese trading outpost. The story goes that as their own men began to die of plague, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the walls. Whether fact or fear, the disease spread. Ships fled the city, unknowingly carrying the plague to Constantinople, to Sicily, and beyond. What followed was devastation on a scale the world had never seen. Tens of millions would die in China, in the Middle East. In Europe, no realm was spared. The Mongol Empire, already straining under its own vastness, now faced a blow it could not outrun. Administrators died. Trade routes faltered. Entire towns were emptied. I visited a former yam station, part of the empire's postal relay. The ledger I found there ended mid-sentence. No final entry. Just a trail that stopped as if the writer had stepped outside and never returned. But the plague did more than kill bodies. It broke momentum. The confidence that had once carried the Mongols across continents began to erode. The sense of destiny gave way to despair, and without clear leadership, the fractures widened. The Khanates, once loosely held together by family and allegiance, now drifted apart. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into competing factions. The Chagatai Khanate fractured along religious and tribal lines. The Golden Horde faced civil war, with rival khans rising and falling in quick succession. And in China, the Yuan dynasty had already been pushed north by the Ming. There was no single moment of collapse, just a steady unraveling. I followed old roads through Central Asia, once patrolled and protected, now overgrown, forgotten. At a market square in Samarkand, I spoke with a local scholar who told me, the Mongols brought the world together, but the plague reminded us how easily the world can fall apart, and yet, even in decline, their legacy lingered. The routes they cleared, the laws they enforced, the bridges they built across language and culture, they did not vanish entirely. Future empires would study them. I saw Persian texts written in Mongol script, Russian chronicles that still mentioned the Golden Horde with caution. In every corner, echoes remained. As I watched the sun set behind the hills that once cradled the Silk Road, I thought about that paradox. The Mongol Empire had connected the world more completely than ever before, but in doing so, it made the world vulnerable to a shared catastrophe. The Black Death did not destroy the Mongols alone, but it exposed the fragility of all empires, and in its wake, the unity that once galloped from the Pacific to the Danube faded into memory, a memory carried now by silence. The map no longer fit on one scroll. What had once been a single sweep of empire was now a patchwork of colors, each with its own language, its own capital, its own ambitions. I traced my finger along the old borders, faded by time, and felt the slow drift of a great empire pulling itself apart. The Mongol world had fractured, not in fire, not in a single act of rebellion, but in the quiet way families grow distant, in the steady erosion of shared purpose. After the death of Genghis Khan, the lands he conquered were divided among his sons and grandsons. It had worked for a while. They were still bound by name, by myth, by blood. But as the decades passed, each Khanate began to move in its own direction. Unity gave way to geography, and then to independence. I stood one morning on the steppe once ruled by the Golden Horde. The grass swayed gently, horses still grazed in the distance. But the days of Batu Khan were long gone. This Khanate, stretching from the Volga to the Carpathians, had once been the terror of Europe. Now it was locked in internal feuds. Princes of Muscovy had begun to resist. Trade slowed, tribute faltered, and without unity, the Horde lost its grip. To the south, in Persia, the Ilkhanate collapsed after a series of weak rulers and deepening economic crises. I visited the remains of a once grand palace near Tabriz. The stone was chipped, the gardens dry. In its halls there had once been scholars, translators, mathematicians. Now, only dust. Without a clear air, the region splintered into warlords and tribal leaders, each claiming a sliver of authority. Central Asia, too, unraveled. The Chagatai Khanate, named after Genghis's second son, had always walked a delicate line between the nomadic world and the settled cities of the Silk Road. Over time, it split into eastern and western halves. I walked through the streets of Al-Malik, where rival claimants once paraded their banners side by side, each swearing legitimacy. It was less an empire now, and more a theater of rivalry. In China, the Yuan dynasty had already been overthrown by the Ming. The Mongols retreated to the north, back into the steppes of Mongolia. But something had changed. They no longer spoke with one voice. The memory of the great Khan remained, but the power behind it had faded. I found coins from that era. Some bore the face of Genghis. Others showed the script of local rulers. Some had both. It was as if each region could not quite let go of the past, yet was already shaping its own future. The Khanates had become regional powers. Some still called themselves Mongol, others did not. What they shared was legacy. What they lacked was unity. And yet, not all was lost. In this fractured landscape, new ideas emerged. New cities rose. Timur, claiming descent from the Mongols, built an empire of his own in Samarkand. Russian states, once subjects of the Golden Horde, began to assert their independence. Trade routes shifted. Cultures blended. The influence of Mongol rule continued to ripple outward, even as the source faded. As I watched a caravan cross a narrow pass in the Pamir Mountains, I thought about how empires end, not always with a scream, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a map redrawn slowly over generations. The Mongol Empire had shattered into Khanates, and the Khanates became histories of their own, separate, uneven, but never truly apart from the shadow of the horsemen who once ruled them all. The sky was wide above me, so wide it seemed to stretch beyond time. I stood alone on the steppe where the wind moved like breath across the earth, and the grass whispered secrets to those who stood still enough to listen. There were no cities here, no monuments, just sky, wind, silence. And yet, this was the heart of something once vast, the place where it all began. The Mongol Empire may be gone, but its legacy still rides the horizon, in language, in borders, in the memory of peoples who once trembled at the sound of distant hooves. What began as a scattered collection of tribes had become the force that reshaped the world. And even now, centuries later, the traces remain. I met a herder not far from the Orkhon Valley. His ancestors, he told me, had always lived here. They still rode the same paths, still built their homes from felt and wood, still followed the stars to guide their herds. He spoke with pride, not of conquest, but of resilience. The empire may have fallen, but the culture endured. In that quiet conversation, I heard echoes of a much older voice. The voice of Genghis Khan, who rose from these very lands with nothing but determination and a vision. But the legacy of the Mongols is not just felt in Mongolia. In Russia, the rise of Moscow was shaped by centuries under the Golden Horde. Administrative systems, tax policies, even military structures borrowed from their former rulers. I walked through the Kremlin and found architecture that carried a subtle Eastern influence, not always visible, but always there. In China, the Yuan dynasty left behind more than chaos. It introduced paper currency, expanded trade, and opened the empire to global exchange. The Ming who followed may have tried to erase the memory, but they inherited the infrastructure that Kublai Khan built: roads, canals, systems of governance, all born in the shadow of the steppe. In the Middle East, the Mongol invasions marked a turning point. Old dynasties fell, new ones rose. The Khanate introduced Persian scholars to Chinese ideas and vice versa. The blend of knowledge during this period, painful as its beginnings were, gave rise to new schools of thought, new art, and new visions of empire. I visited an archive in Iran and found a manuscript copied in 4 languages: Mongolian, Persian, Arabic, Chinese. It was not just a book. It was a crossroads, a reminder that even war can leave behind strange kinds of unity. Of course, not all legacies are uplifting. The Mongols left devastation in their wake. Cities burned, populations were lost, some wounds never fully healed. But history is rarely clean. The same hand that destroys may also build. And in the case of the Mongol Empire, both truths stand side by side. I sat beneath a lone tree miles from any town and watched the stars rise above the plain. This sky, I thought, was the same one they looked up at, the same one that watched over their camps, their battles, their dreams. Their empire is gone, but the ghosts still ride. In story, in silence, in the wind that never stops moving. We try to bury the past with borders, with flags, with time. But some legacies cannot be covered. They remain in the soil, in the names, in the long breath of the world as it remembers what was. And here, in this open silence, you can still feel it, not as a roar, but as a whisper that never ends. The morning light came slow over the horizon. I stood on a ridge overlooking the plains where it all began. Below me, the wind moved through the grass like a quiet tide. There were no signs to mark what had been built or broken here. No ruins, no roads, just earth. And yet, I felt it. The weight of history beneath my feet. The sense that something vast had passed through and was not entirely gone. The Mongol Empire is often taught in moments, in battles, in borders, in names like Genghis and Kublai. But what we see on the surface is only a fraction of the story, a single layer. The truth is deeper, less certain, and far more human. We think of empires as things of stone, palaces, capitals, maps. But the Mongols built their legacy with motion, with breath and hoof and memory. They carried their world with them, not in scrolls, but in stories. And those stories, scattered across time, still wait to be uncovered. I have walked through forgotten towns in Uzbekistan, where Mongol coins still surface after heavy rain. I have read poems in Persian that speak of awe and fear in equal measure. I have sat with elders in the Gobi Desert who recite the lineage of Genghis Khan as if he left only yesterday. There is more to learn, always more. Archaeologists now uncover cities once thought lost. DNA studies trace Mongol migrations through bloodlines still present in millions today. Satellite scans reveal road systems hidden beneath centuries of dust. And every time we peel back the earth, we find something unexpected. A tool, a bone, a fragment of a letter. Clues not to war, but to life. We have only begun to understand how this empire shaped the modern world, how it influenced trade, how it altered languages, how it shifted the balance of power from east to west. The connections made under Mongol rule set the stage for future movements of goods, people, and ideas. the world grew smaller and more dangerous and more alive. But this journey is not just about history, it is about perspective. We often tell ourselves that empires fall because they are flawed, and they are, but they also rise because they are daring, because someone somewhere decided that the world could be larger, that borders could be moved, that difference could be bridged, even if briefly. The Mongols remind us that greatness is not always quiet, but it is also not always permanent. Their rule burned bright and then faded, but the imprint remains, not just in ruins, but in the spaces between them. As I roll up my maps and close my notebook, I feel no end, only another beginning. The road ahead is long, and it leads in many directions, across archives and deserts, through languages and legends, into the hearts of people whose ancestors once rode behind a standard of black and white. The past is not fixed. It shifts when we ask better questions. It opens when we listen, and it lives when we carry it forward. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I have learned one thing on this path. History does not whisper. It waits. And it waits for those who are willing to follow the trail into the dust and listen. So much of what we think we know about history is built from ruins, from names carved in stone or dates etched into textbooks. But the Mongol Empire challenges that. It asks us to see history not as something frozen, but as something that moves, that breathes, that changes shape, like the wind over the steppe. Their story is not just one of conquest, it is also a story of transformation, of how a scattered people, bound by survival, rose to shape the world in ways still felt today. From the reach of the Silk Road to the rhythm of modern trade, from military tactics to cultural exchange, their impact runs deeper than most imagine, and yet, so much remains unseen. The past does not live only in monuments. It lingers in the way roads curve through old lands, in the languages that still carry borrowed words, in the traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next. Even the silence of forgotten places can speak if you stand still long enough to hear it. I did not find all the answers. I never expected to. But every journey into history is less about certainty and more about connection. You begin to realize that the empires of yesterday were made by people no different from us, full of questions, full of ambition, full of contradictions. The Mongols were warriors, yes, but also diplomats, lawmakers, dreamers of impossible unity. And even in their fall, they gave rise to something enduring, a reminder that the world is always in motion, that power does not last, but legacy does. So as we close this chapter of the expedition, remember, history is not finished. It is not silent. It is waiting. Waiting in the maps left incomplete, in the stories not yet told, in the dust beneath our feet. This was only one trail among many, and the journey continues.